Hey, how are we doing? Good. Awesome. My name's Danya, and I'm not strictly a documentarian. I thought I'd just come up here and say that out loud, and at risk of being kicked out of here. However, I'm a translator. What I do is I'm an interventionist, and that doesn't mean that I run these. I would love to. I wish someone would pay me to do this, but they don't. What they do pay me to do, however, is turn really, really crazy, black hole-y type concepts into simplistic solutions, which means things like solve the crisis in higher education in like 2 days. Okay, sure. How do we change people's behavior around nutrition? And how do we do that with 7-year-olds in 4 days? And I'm like, all right, fine. So what I do is I take these crazy big, complicated things that people don't necessarily quite understand and convert them into programming or curricula or poetry, which, always sort of gets me some weird stares once in a while, but I do that too. And I consider that an intervention. And I especially consider poetry an intervention because I feel like communication and language certainly is. When I communicate with you, when I say something out loud, I'm intervening in your train of thought. And I'm causing some sort of change to happen. So other than sort of your actual sort of hard and fast programming interventions that I do, I consider words an intervention. So very much, documentation is an intervention. You're creating an intervention from in the perspective of the user. Someone who is reading your documentation, someone who is responsible for understanding what you're saying and changing their train of thought and changing their ability and their mindset based on what you're telling them, that's a pretty decent responsibility, by the way. So that's kind of that's why I'm here. That's why please don't kick me out. I have more disclaimers because I'm kind of scared. So here we go. This talk might tell you what you already know. Poetry often does that, by the way. It tells you what you already know, but you didn't quite understand or you didn't quite realize you knew. So it would be absolutely fantastic if no one yells at me later for being like, yeah, I knew that. Sure, but then it's very, very possible that it might tell you things that you don't know. So sit tight. The techniques and the processes that are presented in this talk are not a checklist. I put this there because this has happened to me before. I have given people just think about this and think about this and think about this and that. And then they came back to me and said, I did all of them and everything broke. It's not a checklist. Please don't go down and hit everything if you don't have to. You can. It might work, but then it might not. It is, however, just a list of techniques and a list of ideas and a list of perspectives that you can kind of take with you and run with it. Like I said, I'm not a documentarian in the strictest sense of the word. I do a lot of technical writing and scientific writing, but I know that you are, and I know that you do what you do well. I hope you do. This is my assumption. This talk also assumes that you do what you do well. I'm not going to come up here and tell you how to do your job. And yes, I'm not here as a power documentarian. I am, however, here as a technical writer. And I am here as someone who did computer science a lot, and as a poet, and someone who is now a social scientist. So that does give me a specific perspective. In fact, that's why I'm an interventionist. That's why I do a lot of giant, crazy concept translating, because I have these sort of buckets and fields that I mess around with. And very few people hit all those buckets and fields, so I can kind of come up and say, hey, I kind of know all of this, a little. But most importantly, I'm coming here as a narrator. I'm coming here as someone who is, my goal is to sort of help you tell your story in a better way, because poetry does that pretty darn well. So I need to know if everyone's okay with this. All right? Okay. Great. So my goal is to give you a new lens for your work, a poetic lens for your work. Again, more warnings. This is just me. If you don't like poetry, this is going to suck. If you don't like scientists and scientific documents, if you think Albert Einstein was a really, really terrible person, you won't like this. And if you want me to teach you how to write the docs, that's not going to happen. So if there's people out there that are not okay with this, I'm here for 40 minutes. It's a pretty decent nap. Please don't snore, though. I get really nervous when that happens. So fair warning, all my disclaimers and warnings are up here, so no one can yell at me later. So I need to see who's actually going to be listening. So can everyone raise their hands? All right, great. We have quite a few people that are not going to be sleeping through this. Keep them up, keep them up. All right. Now, when I ask you this next question, do not put your hands down. I need a volunteer from the audience. I saw you. You thought I wasn't looking. All right. We have somebody right here. What's your name? Mo. Okay. Mo, I can remember that. I was thinking someone would have like a really complicated, like, I am Lichtenstein, and I'll be like, okay, you're Bob. But you're Mo. This is fine. Well, my real full name's longer, but... Okay. Thank you so much for that, by the way. All right, Mo. So here's what we're doing. When we're writing the docs, all of us are impressing Mo. All right? So you've got a lot of responsibility right there. So Mo is somebody who is going to be reading your docs for some specific reason. Either he's going to be the guy who decides whether to give you money or not if you're grant writing, or he's going to be the guy that decides to give you a shot at something or not. He's going to be the guy proofreading and editing. He's going to be the guy that tells you what to write in your docs, and we know we hate those people. Or he's going to be, here's the most important part that Mo could possibly play, he's going to be the person following your instructions. We're all writing to impress Mo, all right? So randomly, during this talk, I'm going to just turn around and ask you if you're impressed. All right. So, let's see. Let's just jump right into it. Poetry is very, very good at immortality. When you write, you cannot write thinking that what you're writing is never going to be seen again. And you have no idea how many documents I've seen that do that. But here's the thing about, and especially the thing about writing about languages, you know that ultimately it's going to become obsolete. Here's the big problem with technology, right? We know it's going to get improved and edited, and what you just wrote, the 300 pages you just wrote, are probably going to not be relevant in 2 years or less. And the thing is, most of us know that, and we think that it doesn't come across in our writing. It does. People notice. When you write in a way that is written for the next 2 years, that's written for the next 36 months, the user can tell. It kind of bleeds across. But the thing is, we know that it's going to get replaced. I know that. We know that this doc is going to get edited. It's going to move on. Someone's going to come up with something else. Someone's going to reference you, and eventually you're just going to end up in a repository that nobody checks. That's okay, though. But here's the thing. Here's why we still need to think about our writing as being immortal. Poets don't write thinking no one's ever going to see this again. They write to transcend time. They write to say, this is going to last forever and ever and ever. As programmers and as documentarians, we assume that it's okay, that it's not okay when people don't have context for our writing anymore. But how much of poetry do we know and remember and have read that we have no context for anymore? I mean, who has context for most of the stuff Shakespeare says? Now, practically no one. There are very few people that can relate to a lot of things he says. However, it's immortal. However, it's ingrained in our brains. It's still there. Poets write to transcend time. And this is a very, very good example of that. To be or not to be, that is the question. Nobody understands the soliloquy, but everybody knows where it comes from. Even if no one understands your work, they should at least know you wrote it. And they should at least remember that. Immortality is going to bleed across the page. If you write thinking that you're a badass, that actually comes across. And this line is the most referenced, I think, in the world. But here's my point. Good writing will get replaced, yes. Bad writing will get replaced immediately. Epic writing will be edited. The docs that you create, even if they are removed from the context in 2 years, even if whatever you're writing about completely dies and crashes and burns and terrible, terrible things happen to it, your writing will remain. And your writing will get edited. And your writing will get referenced. And even when whatever you're writing about completely disappears off the face of the planet and ends up in a museum somewhere, your documentation is still going to be around for people to say, here's how to write the docs. Check that out. Right to be immortal. Dilemma, technique number 2. Poetry is always about a dilemma. It's always about a conflict. It's always about something's about to happen. There's something really, there's a dissonance, there's a chaos, there's something that I can't quite figure out, and we need to solve this. The thing we assume is that when people read the docs, they know why they're reading them. This isn't always true. There needs to be a context for what's being created. And so the thing about a dilemma is it's always a question. It's always some sort of journey. What do I do? Robert Frost, Two Roads Diverge in a Wood. I have 2 options. What do I do? Docs ultimately answer the question, what do I do? How do I do it? There's a conflict. There is something that I need to resolve. Now the thing is that entire concept is sort of the undercurrent of all docs in any case, right? I mean, you're writing to resolve something. You know that. That's fine. However, in many, many docs, it's not obvious. It's not, you're not powering through the page and saying, guess what? This is the problem. You're assuming that they know why they're reading the docs, and you're assuming they know the problem, which they probably do. But it needs to be hammered through. Why? Because a dilemma creates this sense of urgency. Your worst enemy is not another doc. Your worst enemy isn't a bad doc. Your worst enemy is a lack of initiative. Someone's going to read what you've written and not do anything. That's the thing you're most worried about. Not that someone's going to read what you wrote and think it sucks. Not that someone's going to read what you wrote and go, everything is broken, I hate my life. Nobody cares about that. What you care about is someone's going to read what you wrote and nothing will happen. That's the thing we're avoiding. And in order to create a sense of urgency, in order to make the user feel like he or she is more autonomous, that they have more control over what they're doing, that they're not following your docs just because they have to, that there's a reason, there's a conflict that they can solve, there's a power that they have that they can utilize in order to fix something or promote something or create an answer to something. That is why dissonance is important. That is why making a dissonance obvious is important. 2 roads diverge in a wood. What do I do? It also provides a call to action, which is the most powerful part of any narrative, is the call to action. After every complexity, if you're creating the sense of urgency, the user's going to keep reading your docs even when they don't have to. Or they're going to at least feel like there's a power in your docs, that the docs allow them to do what they need to do and for the following reasons. And so creating this conflict, creating this sort of, you need to save the world right now, and here's why, is a good idea to make obvious when you're writing. And so check on that as that's going around. Be biased. Here's why. There is such a thing called a point of view. And I don't know how much writers do this, because writers are typically a lot better at this, but scientists are very allergic to a point of view. They don't like it at all. And I think the problem also just comes from the fact that if you're incredibly objective, it's considered a sign of being very intelligent. Like, you don't have a point of view, but you can tell me 15 other people's points of view, you must be smart. And as much as that's kind of true, the person reading your docs is coming to you because you're the expert, not them. They're coming to you because they want to not do the thinking that you did. And so having a point of view and letting your bias come through the page is okay. Saying that your idea is ultimately the best one ever and all other docs suck and the user is stupid is not a good idea. But saying that here's an opinion and here's an opinion and here's how most people do it, but here's how I do it because the following is a very good idea. Bias emerges in poetry a lot. Earth hath not anything to show more fair. Dull would he be of soul who could pass by a sight so touching in its majesty. Wordsworth is accusing you of being a dull, boring, ridiculous person if you don't agree with him. This is definitely a bias. This happens in poetry a lot, and it's okay. What he's saying here is this is how pretty London looks at this moment, composed upon Westminster Bridge. There's a reason opinions flow through and have an impact, and there's a reason opinions come through in poetry. And a lot of it really just has to do with you assuming that you're the expert and the reader assuming that you're the expert and allowing you to influence them in that way and allowing you to intervene in their life in that way. So that is okay to come across. Like I said, high objectivity is considered a characteristic of the intelligentsia. And so we are very allergic to letting a point of view come across or letting a bias come across because that might just seem terrible. But there is a reason this is happening. I'm not saying don't be objective at all. I'm saying be holistic and all-encompassing. Encompass your opinion and encase your opinion in other opinions. And encase your opinion in extremely objective analyses of what's going on. And the nice thing about a point of view also is that it provides context. It allows the user to sort of engage with you on an emotional level, and there's a greater sense of relevancy there. They go, oh, you're human. You did this too. Okay, this is good. This is good. When we provide a context to the user, we're creating a connection there, and we're establishing some sort of means of communication that they can understand. And actually, as documentarians, that is the very first priority, is to create that line of communication between us and the user, and making sure that it's there, and making sure it's understood. Context is the best way to do it. Point of views provide really, really good context. Error. Another thing that scientists are very, very allergic to. Poetry deals with error in a very fascinating way. Poetry, interestingly enough, is kind of all about error. Bad things happen all the time. All the time. Ships are launched and then they sink. People eat each other. Ugh, it's terrible. Poetry, there's so many things that happen in poetry that are just wrong and disturbing, and you feel uncomfortable and you don't know what to do, and everything just goes to hell and back, and it's awful. But it makes for really, really good poetry, and we don't end up hating the poet either most of the time. Why is that? Why is epic poetry still epic when everything is going wrong? It's because poetry deals with error and problems and conflict like a cyclical process, like something that's part of a journey. We tend to think of conflict and errors and awful, awful, terrible things as consequences. In poetry, sure, they're consequences, but they're consequences in a very, very cyclical, evolving path. And so when we're talking about error, it's wise to not just go, it's not going to happen, it's not going to happen, it's not going to happen. Oops, it's okay. The better idea is, maybe it'll happen, maybe it'll happen. It happened, okay, let's move on, maybe it'll happen again. That takes away a lot of the negativity around error. and it takes away, it makes us more vulnerable, and it makes us more human. A lack of error is very contrary to human ability. And so this ability to not see error as just a consequence that needs to be avoided at all costs, to see error as just part of a process, makes anybody reading your docs so much more comfortable with dealing with it. And also, that's kind of how all the best computer scientists are born, is they go, I'm okay with breaking shit, and then things break, and they go, I'll fix it, and then they fix it, and they fix it in a way that's better than everybody else, and go, oh, I guess I'm a computer scientist. So when this happens, it's okay to create the sense in the person reading your docs. And so the key here is this "and now." That is a process. Bad things happened, and now bad things happened, but then this other thing happened. So cyclical, creating a process out of it. A lack of error is contrary to human ability, which I said again. I guess I'm just reading all my slides really prematurely. It's okay. But here's my punchline. Do not consider error punctuation. It is a process. And do not, when you're writing your docs, don't consider error punctuation, and don't make the user think they are either. Marie Curie, very famous scientist. This actually, there are very few scientific documents that truly exemplify everything I'm saying, but when I do find them, I tend to get very happy about it. In her doctoral thesis, she, again, emphasizes that there's an evolution going on in a process. There's this, the study that she's doing is constantly evolving. There's this change. So when she says, this went wrong, we don't go, wow, Mary, you're a terrible scientist. You should not get the Nobel Peace Prize. Sorry. Instead, we just go, oh, it's an evolution, so we're just adding to this process. Instead of seeing an error as a consequence, it's an amendment. It's an amendment to a process that's already happening. It's an amendment to the evolution. And we also have to recognize, and we're, as we're pretty good at recognizing the temporary nature of what we do. But other than temporary, we should also look at it as provisional, as something that it is going to be edited and is going to move on. And it's something that is only true in the moment in which it is true, else it is false. And that is my philosophical rant of the day. Mo, how are we doing?
I'm awake and I'm fully engaged.
Okay, good. Which sort of brings us to one more really, really important thing, reiteration. Also something that a lot of people don't like. Poetry loves it, though. Poetry is very, very good at repeating itself. There is a place where the sidewalk ends. A bunch more words, to the place where the sidewalk ends. And a bunch more words, the place where the sidewalk ends. I already knew the sidewalk ended. However, the thing this allows us to do is after every major event, after every turning point, after every catastrophe, calamity, after every complexity, and that's kind of the key word here, after every complexity, the purpose gets repeated. Now here's the thing, when I'm reading this, I'm not getting completely offended and going, Silverstein, dude, I know the sidewalk ended. I'm not mad at Silverstein. I think he's cool. When I'm reading it, I'm not thinking you're completely offending me. I'm instead just thinking, it's palatable for me. It's on my mind. It's at the forefront of my brain. I keep thinking it's important. The sidewalk, it's important. It's ending, it's important. So don't assume that if you repeat something too much, that the user's just going to hate you and go, dude, please. They're not going to do that because the point you're trying to make is after every complexity, you're reiterating your purpose, and you're reiterating your purpose in order to make it palatable. You're chewing it down. You're making it smaller and better and smaller and better, and it's at the forefront of the person's brain. The person who you're talking to through your writing should not forget why they're reading what they're reading. And even if it's something you assume that they're not going to do, repetition and reiteration allows them to connect the purpose back to your initial premise after every complexity. This is especially important when you kind of get into the deep, grunty writing, and it's just sort of paragraph after paragraph after paragraph of things. Every time you hit a complex problem, or every time you hit a complex line of thought, you bring back the purpose. How does it relate back? It doesn't need to be straight up repetition, which poetry, again, is very good at, but it does need to bring back context periodically so that the person that's reading your docs is never loses sight of what you're trying to do. I'm hoping this is making sense so far because everyone's looking down. All right. Oh, okay. Hey, success. All right. Einstein actually, in his theory of relativity, in the interest of clearness, it appeared to me inevitable that I should repeat myself frequently. Now, this is relativity we're talking about. However, this completely applies to docs as well. Metaphors. This is actually kind of the most important point. Think about it. Even when we're creating these new programming sequences and we're creating these new languages, or even as I'm up here and I'm talking to you, all the words I can use typically already exist. All the evidence that you're going to be drawing from to write your docs already exists. Every letter, every alphabet, every character already exists. All we do as documentarians is we rearrange them in new and interesting ways. And we compare them in new and interesting ways. And all we're doing really is creating metaphors. Poetry is very good at metaphors. I remember this gave me so much grief in high school. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. These comparisons are what make poetry incredibly unique. It gives us context, again, for something that we're about to do. It allows us to rearrange the patterns of our mind. And it allows us to rethink the things that we're doing because instantly the angles are turned, the perspectives are turned. We're making remote associations between things we didn't think were related at all. This happens a lot in programming language without us realizing it's happening a lot in programming language. But the beauty of all of this, the beauty of any documentation at all, is your ability to create comparisons and your ability to draw from existing knowledge in new and interesting ways. The nice thing about metaphors, too, is that it leaves the power of the context not in your hands, but in the hands of the person that's reading your documentation. So, for example, shall I compare thee to a summer's day, thou art more lovely, more temperate? You're assuming that the person who's reading understands that a summer's day is lovely and temperate, and can make that comparison. If I ask you, actually, Mo, tell me, describe a summer's day.
Stereotypical summer's day or Oregonian summer's day?
Pick one.
Cloudy, rain several times a day. My summer bicycling clothing is drenched by occasional indication of the angry clouds above me. My fixie and I, on their journey to work, excited by puddles.
Mo just wrote poetry. But it's actually illustrating my point, which is that to Shakespeare, a summer's day is mellow and calm. And to Mo, it involves puddles and rain. And so the thing is, Shakespeare isn't telling you be temperate, summer's day, warm, calm, lovely, blah, blah, blah. He's assuming that you're going to make that connection. He's saying, summer's day, let your imagination fly. And metaphors do that really well, where when they engage you and they create these different, when they create these different connections and patterns, you don't actually fill in the pattern, so the reader does. I'm relying on Mo's interpretation of a summer's day for this to make sense. When you're creating these rearrangements and these metaphors and these comparisons, you're relying on the user's ability to make those connections. And you're relying on the user's imagination to put them together. When you say, this is a bucket, you're assuming that the user knows what a bucket is. All of these are really, really important because when you throw these in there, and when you throw these adequate comparisons in there, and when you create these metaphors, and you create these rearrangements, and when you reinvent the common language to describe your point, the really, really awesome thing that happens is that instead of you pushing out context to the reader, you're actually pulling it from the reader. And so instead of pushing something out of the page, the reader is pulling it out of themselves. And that creates greater relevancy, greater autonomy. And when the reader feels autonomous and powerful and relevant, they're sticking to your docs. They will, because of the way they make them feel and because of the way they make them understand. I did it again. That's okay. How much time do we have, by the way? All right. Which brings me to my point. As scribes, we have an immense responsibility. And the responsibility that we have is to create an intervention in people's ability to do something. And that is a humongous responsibility. And so when we're writing, when we're creating this language, and when we're rearranging this language, and when we're attempting to make an art out of the thing that we are placing on the page, the most important thing we can do is learn from the masters. And the thing that has subsisted all through time, and the thing that has existed despite every attempt of high school to make sure it doesn't, after every generation, is poetry. And I am going to leave you with Stephen Hawking, who has said some pretty interesting things. But the analysis of language, the sole remaining task for philosophy is the analysis of language. As documentarians, we are adding to this movement. We are adding to this ability to reinvent how people view communication. And all of this needs to be understood by a broader public. The way you know that your documentation is eternal, the way you know that it's going to last, and the way you know it's going to be immortal, which is the most important thing when you're writing, is assume it will be immortal, is to make sure as many people can print on it as possible. As many people can read it, understand it, leverage it, love it, and connect with it as possible. And hopefully all of the things that we just talked about are going to emphasize that. And this brings me to my punchline. If you remember nothing else from today, well, no, from this talk, everyone else has very important things to say. But if you remember nothing else from this particular talk, the thing that I would urge you to just bear in mind, how do you translate science into poetry? How do you create the sense of poetry in what you're writing? The bottom line is elegance. The bottom line is, can you make your documents elegant? The big punchline of poetry is elegance. If that is something that you can capture in your page, into your words, if that's something that you can capture in this language and dialogue that you're creating between yourself and the reader, then you have done everything that I could have ever asked of you to do. And I'm done. So, questions, comments?